So the way this is obviously an enormous subject, but the way in which we've approached it is that I'm going to talk very much about the colonialist imperial side today, to think through what are some of the mentalities that were at stake. I'm also going to talk about slavery, the origins of slavery, mentalities towards slavery, the church and slavery, very complicated position. In his book, Professor Jennings talks about a kind of deformed, distorted shape of Christianity that's brought to the Americas, the Caribbean, in the end of the 15th century and early 16th century. And I think we're going to have a chance to see, at least hope to get a sense of what drove that kind of Christianity, and to get a sense of where it comes from, but also to give a sense that it wasn't all one position. Particularly talking about the Dominicans, the Dominican order, who were in the Americas from the time of Columbus, many of whom, prominent ones, took a position against slavery, so that there was an opposition, but I think we need to keep a sense of perspective. The Dominicans were actually a very small number. I'm going to talk about this figure, Bartolomeo de las Casas, who's always held up as this sort of figure of resistance to imperialism and slavery. I think we'll see that his position is more complicated than that. So I want to, in the short time we have today, give a sense of a very big picture. So I hope, and just some of the themes are going to talk about where this notion, what's driving this notion of conquest, to think briefly about the figure of Columbus, how it's shaped by a growing expansion of contacts between Spain and Portugal and Africa. Already by the time Columbus comes to Americas in the early 1490s, Spain and Portugal, particularly Portugal, have extensive relations and even the beginnings of colonies in Africa. There is growing contact with Asia. Important part of this is the role of religion. And that's, of course, given the nature of our course, where I'm going to focus this morning, and Nazanin will talk about on Wednesday. I want to talk a bit about the doctrine of discovery, which, as we all know, is very much in the news, very much debated, really, only, interestingly enough, only really since the 1990s. So it's been just over 20 years that this idea of the doctrine of discovery has really come back to the fore. We'll get a sense of what it is. Not going to go through the voyages of Columbus, that's not of direct interest to us. I want to think more about the figure of Christopher Columbus, and in particular, his religious convictions and his role in the origins of slavery in Hispaniola and in the islands primarily. But it begins, of course, a movement. Christopher Columbus is known naturally for his role as a navigator, explorer, what's long time called the New World, the person who attempted to find his way to Asia through another route. And the reason that he did that was because the Ottoman Turks had blocked access to the east through the Mediterranean. So part of what he was doing was to try and find an alternative route to what he thought would be the inexhaustible riches of Asia. We know that he ends up in the Indies, and in many ways that was to his disappointment. But there's a side of the story that I want to stress, which is not directly about his voyages, but about his mentality, what he thought he was doing. The end of the 15th century, we've mentioned this already, was a time of enormous apocalyptic expectations. The year 1500 had a particular resonance, really in the West, of being a time when possible that Christ would return. It was seen as a golden age. There was enormous anticipation. On the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal, this mentality was especially strong, and for a number of reasons. In 1474, the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon, the major kingdoms of Spain, through much of the Middle Ages, Spain was really divided into many smaller kingdoms. It came together in the figures of Ferdinand and Isabella, who became the monarchs of not yet a wholly united Spain, but of a united monarchy. This was seen as part of this apocalyptic narrative, the emergence of Spain. And Spain's self-identity is crucial to this role, because it was seen that the year 1500 would also see the liberation of Jerusalem, a crusade, continuing the long medieval tradition of crusades, that Spain would have a special role in bringing Jerusalem back to the Christians. So there's this powerful crusading mentality, and that's crucial to what the sort of mentality that's taken to the Indies and Americas. This sense of a kind of divine mission. And it was hoped from Columbus onwards that the riches that would be brought from the Indies would fuel this new glorious Spain. This is an idea we will continue to think about when we get to Catholic reform. This special role, sense of Spain, that living in the last age. Remember, Luther also thought that he was living in the last age. This is a shared mentality, but one parallel we can see between Luther and the Spanish is they both had a sense of a special role. And there's a couple of events that we need to think about, which was part of this. First, the unification of the thrones. You see 1474. Ferdinand and Isabella, and they are declared by the Pope to be the Catholic monarchs. And that's very important. It sounds like an obvious description of them, because of course they were Catholics. But nevertheless, they were given this title as almost like the Catholic rulers, a special status conferred by the Pope. And that enhanced this notion of a kind of Spanishness. This period also saw the expulsion of the Muslims known as the Moors in the Iberian Peninsula, the fall of Granada, which was the last great outpost of Muslim Spain, the Moors, the Moorish kingdom. The victory over this was also very much a crusade, and now Spain and Portugal belonged to the Spanish and the Portuguese. But it went further than this. You have also the expulsion of the Jews, and those who are not expelled are forced to convert, forced baptisms. Although in Spain they will never have the same status as those who were born, what we might call cradle Catholics. They were always retained this sense of being suspicious. The Inquisition, which I haven't put on here, which is obviously another part of this, the formation of the Inquisition, which was to ensure a purely Catholic Spain. And converted Jews were seen as dangerous. Perhaps they in secret were still practicing their old faith. And the Inquisition really focuses on these people who are known as the conversos. So there's this sense of crusading that's happening on various fronts to establish a Catholic Spain. Catholicism very much at the heart of its identity. And it goes beyond that to this sense of what forms Catholicism. We get the language of a kind of pure blood. There is a kind of pure line of Catholicism. Of course, it has for us resonances of what happened in the 20th century, but this notion of a kind of purity of blood of the Catholic faith. So this is all these are just touching on them briefly, but to keep in mind that this is very much in the background of what happens afterwards. The conquistadors, the people we're familiar with, who go to, as Nazim will talk about, to the Aztec Empire, to the Indies, to the Americas, they are a kind of class of like knights who are deeply ambitious and see the overseas as a chance to win fame and fortune. They combine together both religion, almost in a kind of medieval knightly way, religion with conquest. So all of these things are, I'm sorry, I'm having to move at a fair pace because there's lots I want to talk about. At the same time, after Columbus's voyages, we have the emergence of what's known as the doctrine of discovery. And it comes from the papacy. Pope Alexander VI, not part of our story today, but many concubines, many children, many nephews appointed to high church. If you have this sense, if you ever watched the Borgias or the Medici, Alexander VI always comes across as the epitome of the worst of the Renaissance popes. He's the most notorious. But he is the one who because we have this competition between the Portuguese and the Spanish in the Americas. And it is in that context of competition that this papal bull, Inter Caetera, is issued by Alexander VI, as you see in 1493. What does it do? What is this document that you have a chance to look at? What does this document say? Well, we can see here that any land not inhabited by Christians was available to be discovered, exclusive Spanish rights to what Columbus had encountered. But at the heart of this is something that we will continue to talk about in the next half an hour or 40 minutes or so, is that this idea of the status of the indigenous peoples. And here a quotation from the document: "The Catholic faith and the Catholic religion be exalted and be everywhere increased and spread, that the health of souls can be cared for, and that barbarous nations be overthrown and brought to the faith itself." This kind of frames the argument. We'll talk about De la Casas in a little bit. This frames a central argument, and that is about the indigenous people in the Americas and the slaves who are brought from Africa beginning early in the 16th century. Do they have the position or status of being fully human? Are they able to receive the same rights as the Europeans? This is a fierce debate. Are they barbarians? How should they be allowed to be educated? Should they even be allowed to come into the church? And one of the things the Catholic Church will do in the 16th century is not allow indigenous men, of course, to become priests. That the church should remain in the hands of the Spanish. This idea that the indigenous people should be converted but held in a particular space, nor only as laity, with few being able to enter into. But I just put this here to show you how enduring this doctrine of discovery is, right through into the 19th century. The famous case of Johnson and Mackintosh, where you have John Marshall's opinion, which was a unanimous decision, that the principle of discovery gave European nations an absolute right to New World land. So that's in America in the 19th century. Also from this period that we need to be aware of is this sort of spectacular treaty known as the Treaty of Tordesillas, 1494, which literally divides the globe. And I'll show you an image of it in a moment. because there's this rivalry between Portugal and the Spanish, the Pope essentially divides the world between them, where the Spanish will be and where the Portuguese will be. And that will have enormous impact because it determined for later history which would be Spanish lands and which would be Portuguese colonies. And that story will come up when we talk later about the Jesuit missions to Congo, Ethiopia, which of course Africa was put in the hands of the Portuguese, as was Brazil. The rest was given to the Spanish. I've just put some more information here that we don't need to talk to, but just to say that this initial division in 1494 was revised somewhat to give the Portuguese Brazil, but then the same thing was done to the Indies. Sorry, to the east in the Pacific Ocean, dividing Asia between the two. Oh, there we go. Here you see the line of 1494, and then you get the one which was before it of 1493. So what it does is move this way to allow the Portuguese to settle in Brazil, what is now Brazil. But this going this direction was for the Portuguese, this going this direction was for the Spanish, hence the influence enduring influence of Spain. This is a slightly later map, but gives you a sense of how that colonial patterns would continue. Africa being very much right through to Macau, Malacca, Goa, which will be an important place when we talk about the Jesuits, central place for the Jesuits to do their missions into China and the Philippines. So you can see this sort of kind of breathtaking sense of being able to divide the world, and the Pope clearly having the sense that it fell to him to be able to divide the world. But the fact that it was done has enormous consequences in the subsequent history of these lands. Nazanin will talk about this more, just to give you a sense of where the Spanish, and to a certain extent the Portuguese in the east, what would emerge as the essential colonized lands. So for the myths, and I have to say that when I was young in school, we had a teacher who read to us, which was one of the most famous 19th century accounts of what was called the Age of Exploration by a man named William Prescott, a famous book, which talked about these conquests very much in a sense of a kind of glorious Spain, these conquistadors with their brave achievements. And so I put here, what are some of the myths of this? The victory of the idea, and Nazanin will talk about this later, the idea that this small band of very brave men overcame a massive and ancient and essentially pagan empire. That for the Spanish, the defeat of both the Incas and the Aztecs was a sign of their special election, their crusading role that I spoke about before. It was confirmation of who they were. We'll find out again that the story is more complex. That, as I've already mentioned, that those who were being conquered were barbarians. And just like in the 19th century missionary culture, when the Bible is taken to Africa and Asia, but particularly Africa, the Bible was seen as this tool of civilizing people. It wasn't just conversion, they were civilizing them. And this is an idea that's prevalent in this period, this notion of barbarians who are being civilized. All these rumors that they are cannibals that they sacrifice babies, all the sort of things. We'll see this again when we talk about witchcraft, this kind of othering that happens that creates these barbarians. Well, again, Nazanin will show us that it was a very different story. Providential, this goes back to Columbus, this notion of the mission being providential, God's unfolding will in the world. And also, and this is not so much a myth, but a reality, that the relations between the Spanish and the indigenous people became a model for wider and later European colonial endeavors. Here's just some information. I don't need to go through all of this, but you can see that in these numbers are, of course, highly suggestive rather than, there's no census being taken, there's no accurate numbers. These are guesstimates. But somewhere that historians have placed it, somewhere around by the time that Columbus arrives, the indigenous population of the Caribbean and the Americas ran somewhere to about 57 million. That it's made up, of course, as Columbus realizes, but doesn't really understand, made up of many different groups, many different peoples, many different languages, extremely different cultures. But they all, in a way, suffer the same fate. And that is that it will be disease, as we shall see, that essentially wipes out these populations already by the first half of the 16th century. I think this is a subject which is one has to be very careful about. Again, in the narratives, there is a kind of legend, myth, whatever you want to call it, that of strong resistance amongst religious figures to what was happening right from the beginning with particularly the Spanish, the Spanish who had gone out to the Americas. This is true, but I think we have to hold up that it is a complex story with no easy narrative, because the resistance was located to a relatively small number of people, and largely, not exclusively, largely to the religious order of the Dominicans. It's there that we find the most outspoken. And they are indeed, as we'll see in a moment, very outspoken. But the questions that arise right from the start is what to do with these indigenous peoples. Should one learn their languages? Should one, and this is a question we will have again when we talk about the Jesuits, should one in any way work with their culture to try to Christianize them? Is there something from their cultures that can be adopted or adapted to Christianity? Can the gospel be translated into their languages? But even more fundamentally, should they be baptized? Do they become real Christians? Can you be sure? Because you have this sort of anthropology of them, which is deeply suspicious. But the early missionaries do see, and these are mostly Dominicans and Franciscans, but these early missionaries do take up the role that they should be converted. But that creates a very bitter dynamic between the missionaries, particularly the Dominicans, and the Spanish, the conquistadors, those who were looking to settle. And here, just again, sort of briefly, but one of the things I want to note that is very early on, in 1503, you have the creation of what are called these encomienda, this system. It was a system of settlement, almost kind of replicating the European feudal system, in which it was meant to be, they were kind of economic units, largely like farms, plantations, and they needed slaves. So this is at the heart of the emergence of slave culture. And of course, in the first instance, it's the enslavement of the indigenous population. But that becomes a problematic. But you see that at the same time, the Spanish are settling with and creating these systems of encomienda. The population is shrinking because of disease, because of slaughter, all sorts of reasons. And that's going to be one of the reasons that they turn to Africa to provide slaves, because the indigenous people are literally being wiped out. But there's another argument which I'll come to in a moment. You can just see some of the figures already by 1508, 1514, 40,000 slaves brought to Hispaniola. This is the Spanish in the Caribbean. This expansion of the encomienda system across the Caribbean, but it will also spread to Mexico and into what is now Venezuela. As this economic system is being developed, of course, that brings on the need for labor and slaves. I've mentioned something about the critical resistance that emerges very early on, and that is some of the Dominicans are from early stage appalled by what they see, above all the slavery of the indigenous people and their treatment. And one of the most insignificant figures in this respect is the friar Antonio Montesinos, who takes a prominent role in both preaching and writing, denouncing what he sees as the venal, brutal character of the Spanish colonialists. He takes it to a very dramatic length in that he denies absolution to their confessions. He seeks to establish contact back in Spain to try and persuade the king, who by this time will become Charles V of the Reformation. And he has some success, the emergence of the Burgos laws in 1512. The point here is that we have this bitter rival between the colonialists and the Dominicans. The colonialists want to get rid of these pesky Dominicans and their views. This leads to an investigation, and in 1512, the Burgos laws. And that has the impact of making the indigenous peoples directly under the control of the Spanish king and not under the colonialists. And that is part of this dynamic that Charles V actually has very ambivalent views towards what he sees happening in Spain amongst the brutality of the colonialists. He's open, Charles himself was a deeply religious man. He's open to the arguments of the Dominicans. He takes the view in these laws that the indigenous people should be converted to Christianity. And the Dominicans are going to take the lead, much more so than the Franciscans for reasons that we don't need to go into. But it's the Dominicans who really are at the forefront of this. But as I say, the shortage of labor for these encomienda systems really is leads to the massive import of slaves from particularly West Africa. We'll show a map in a moment. That these are being brought in increasing numbers, but the notion of slavery, I want to say, goes right back to Columbus. Columbus himself sent indigenous people back to Spain with the idea to show that they could be slaves and would be the kind of motor of the Spanish economy. As I mentioned before, the decimation of the indigenous peoples leads to this necessity of the slave trade. Here is where we start to begin the complication of the role of the church. Because the Dominicans, who in many ways had argued that the indigenous people should not be enslaved, did not take that attitude towards those who were being brought from Africa. And that's a position we're going to see again with de las Casas, who was a leader of the Dominicans. They made a distinction. They would eventually go back on that distinction, but in these crucial years, they made the argument that while indigenous people should not be enslaved, there was nothing wrong with bringing slaves from Africa. So that gives you a sense of the kind of mentality that's at play here. So once more, when we hear these narratives of the kind of resistance of the church, we need to keep in mind that it's far more complicated than you will often find in a textbook story. Here you just see that by the middle of the 16th century, already in Hispaniola, you have 12,000 slaves being brought from Africa. By 1570, that's already risen to 56,000, and they become an essential part of the establishment of the plantation economy. Have a chance to come back to that at a future date. The church by no means has clean hands in this, because the church, well, we talked about some resistance of Dominicans. The church, as it was in Europe, becomes an important landowner, and many of the leading church figures own slaves. This will be replicated in later centuries by Protestants, when Protestants come into the Caribbean, that they will run plantations in which slave labor is seen completely compatible with religious beliefs. As long as you take this attitude towards converting them, you are civilizing them, but that by no means extends to emancipation. Here, just one example. This is from later, 1577. The dean and chapter of Santo Domingo petitioned the king for slaves to work in the cathedral. I want to move to De las Casas and a couple of these other figures to give us a sense of what's going on here. Probably the most significant figure in the Dominican resistance is a man named Pedro de Corboda. And he, in a way, is the most influential in shaping the Dominican attitudes towards indigenous people. But as I say, that attitude, at least for a considerable amount of time, was very different towards the African slaves. His work is printed, it's circulated. He seeks to win support in Spain at home to stop the enslavement of indigenous peoples. And as we've seen already, there was some movement towards that. The Dominican vision, again, this is always the danger of speaking in generalities. We always have to be mindful that these are fragmented views. But they are deeply opposed to these encomiendas, which were essentially like plantations. They were settlements. We'll see this later with the Jesuits. These were settlements in which people were brought from the countryside, brought together, and it was thought not only as kind of units of labor, but for some seen as ways of converting the population by bringing them out of the rural areas. The king has some sympathy for or at least some sympathy for those who oppose slavery, and he is to some extent persuaded by the Dominican accounts of the abuses that are taking place in these encomienda. So, as I've already said, we had the Burgos laws of 1512, but the king continues. He allows the Dominicans to have lands in what's now Venezuela, which were intended not to have slaves. But those who resisted slavery were simply overwhelmed by the power of the colonists and the wealth that they were generating, and also the reception in Spain to this now flow of wealth from the Indies. I want to say something about perhaps the most famous figure in this. If you study political science, certainly of the early modern period, De las Casas is a very important figure. He was both a scholar of law and theology. He goes to the Americas. He has himself an encomienda. He has slaves. He's in Hispaniola. He's completely part of this colonial system, and he's profiting enormously. But at some point, and he talks about this in writing, he has a conversion experience. And that conversion experience leads him, amongst other things, to become a Dominican and also to turn against enslavement. But again, against enslavement of indigenous peoples, not against Africans who are being brought in increasing numbers to the Americas. He challenges the prevalent Spanish narrative that the conquest is God's will, and rather starts to, this is an image of him, starts this idea that what the Spanish are doing, and he's a prominent preacher but also writer, so he becomes a very significant figure in his writings and in his preaching, argues that what the Spanish are doing in the Americas is actually contrary to God's will, and that slavery is an abomination. He becomes famous, is probably the thing he's most famous for, is that he returns to Spain to engage in a debate on what's known as the Indian question. He is seen by this point as a major advocate for the cause of the indigenous peoples. And when he goes back to Spain, very briefly, I'm just going to put it very briefly, he gets involved with in a very public debate with another figure about whether the Indians should be treated as humans and are to be accorded the rights of humans. De las Casas becomes prominent in sort of prevailing in this debate, but he's known in history for his extensive arguments against slavery, against the encomienda system, against what he rails as the abuses of the Spanish. And he famously says that freedom is better than forced baptism. And that's an argument with a particular resonance in Spain, because forced baptism was exactly what had been required of both Jews and Moors. If you stayed in Spain, you were required to be baptized, although you were never regarded as being of the same status as the sort of Spanish themselves, that notion of the pure blood. So there is actually an interesting connection between the Spanish view of the indigenous peoples and their view of Jews and Muslims as never being wholly one of them. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but just to say that Las Casas is also well known for evolving what he saw as a vision of what should happen in the Americas. And that is that it was an opportunity with the indigenous peoples to create a new Catholic culture. This is an idea we'll come back to, that Spanish and Portuguese imperialism, because increasingly, as we've seen from 1517, the Reformation is dividing Europe, and from the Catholic perspective, these heretics are, the heresy is spreading. There's this hope that kind of goes back to Columbus, that they will create a more perfect Catholic society in the New World. That it's a chance that they're almost in the Garden of Eden and they can start again. And de las Casas shares that idea that what the church should be doing, not complicit with slavery and the abuses of the colonial system of the Spanish, and well, particularly the Spanish, but rather the church should be laboring for a complete renewal of society, a new vision that will be free from the heresies that are plaguing Europe. So this kind of continues this, just a bit more information for you. Las Casas comes to advocate that there should be peaceful relations between the church and the indigenous people. That does not yet translate into, I think, full acknowledgement. I think there's clearly, even within de la Casa's, a sense of European superiority. But nevertheless, his views are quite remarkable, and it's their prominence that often, I think, gives us a slightly skewed view of how much resistance from the church there was to the imperial system, the colonialist system, and slavery. Because, just to come back to a point I made earlier, for the most part, and this will continue through Mexico and will continue for a very long time, the church is fully complicit in the slavery culture and benefits enormously from it, and is, of course, itself in many places financially, or since itself is using slave labor. So we need to maintain a kind of perspective on this, not to take de la Casas as representative. He is much more a kind of John the Baptist figure in this story. Here's a map that will be familiar with you, just giving it a sense. I'm going to be talking about Congo, Angola, and West Africa a little later in the context of the Portuguese and the Jesuits, but you can see the extensive Angola remained a Portuguese colony right up till the 1970s. You can see that Angola was a crucial place for the transportation of slaves across the Atlantic. I just give you a sense of the numbers. 42% are going to the West Indies, actually relatively small number to Mexico and Central America, and then also a very large number to Brazil. Again, a point on which we have to be very careful not to try and see the story as anything other than it was. There was some concern amongst the missionaries and then the established church that to find the appropriate way, as they saw it, towards bringing slaves into the church. The debate rages on about whether they can become equal members of the church, but one of the central questions is, and this remains, for instance, for the British in the Caribbean later, is education. Is it dangerous to educate them? Is it dangerous to put education and making it available to slaves because they might use it against them? And so there's this ongoing debate about, and how much of the religion should they be taught? Also, of course, deep suspicion of traditions that are brought from Africa, fear of syncretism, like the sort of fear of the Jews and the Muslims, fear that they hadn't actually fully converted, if they had converted at all. So certain amounts of concessions are made, education for 30 days before baptism, but you see it runs through to the 17th century before we have any notion of comprehensive religious instruction, well over 100 years before there's any agreement on whether slaves should be educated. And also, I mean, what would seem quite amazing to us is at that point they are allowed to attend Mass. Sorry, this, I have to go over here. Yeah. So I want to, we're just about to conclude, so I want to move just forward to a few things. You can look at the PowerPoint here. But I want to give a sense that, and Nazanin will tell us much more about this on Wednesday, that there is an enormous amount of conflict within this system. The colonialists and the church, particularly the Dominicans, are in a constant battle here. But there is also resistance. There are revolts amongst the indigenous people, and there are also slave revolts already in the 16th century. Jamaica being one example, but there are others, that slave revolts, so that this is a highly fragile system in many ways that depends on slave labor to hold it together, but is itself at times teetering. When the encomiendas were failed, this had enormous repercussions for the whole of the colonial system, particularly in the Caribbean. There isn't the same sort of wealth that will come out of Mexico and later Peru. So this remains a largely agrarian culture, and that's why the attention will eventually shift more towards the lucrative lands of, and then you can see here, the devastation of the populations, and that's something we're going to see in the Aztec story, that the devastation that takes place through disease, war, and slaughter. Okay, there's more to be said. We'll pick it up on Wednesday, but in your readings, you have both the doctrine of discovery, of more recent discussion of this, and for Wednesday, some actual Aztec perceptions of the Spanish. So I'll leave it.